I will tell you the 3 things I will never let an agent do in my practice. Never autonomously prescribe a controlled substance. Never transmit a clinical recommendation directly to a patient without physician review. Never modify a treatment plan based on imaging it has not been cleared to interpret. Those are my red lines, and I want to spend an entire episode explaining exactly why they exist, what the failure modes look like in practice, and how to think clearly about the safety envelope for agentic AI in a clinical context. Because if you believe everything I have said in the first 8 episodes without this episode, you are not ready to actually deploy this technology. Let me start with a frame that I think cuts through most of the safety debate in medical AI. Safety is an architecture problem, not a model problem. That is the insight from the OpenClaw Hospital paper, but I want to develop it in the safety context specifically. A model problem would be the AI hallucinates a drug name, or misidentifies an anatomical structure, or reasons incorrectly about a clinical case. Model problems are real and they occur, but model problems are bounded. They produce incorrect outputs that a reviewing physician can catch. If the physician review gate is in place, a model error is a near miss, not a harm. An architecture problem is different. An architecture problem occurs when the system is designed in a way that allows a harmful action to execute without the physician review gate. When the AI has permissions to send a prescription without physician sign-off. When the AI has access to a patient's chart and can modify it directly. When the AI can contact a patient with clinical guidance without anyone reviewing that guidance first. In those cases, a model error is not caught by the review gate, because the review gate was not built into the architecture. This is why I spend so much time in this series on the architectural papers, Medical OS, OpenClaw Hospital, the permission frameworks, and not just on the model capability papers. A model that is 95% accurate is useless in a clinical context where the architecture does not include a process to catch the 5% of errors. A model that is 80% accurate in a context with tight architecture, real-time audit, and physician review at every consequential step is safer than the 95% model with no guardrails. The safety conversation in medical AI has spent too long on the model accuracy question and not enough on the architecture question. Today's episode is about the architecture question. Let me walk through the 5 failure modes I consider most important in agentic clinical AI. The 5 scenarios where an agentic system is most likely to produce a patient safety event. Failure mode 1, hallucinated medications. This is the most widely discussed failure mode in clinical AI, and for good reason. Large language models can produce plausible-sounding but non-existent drug names, incorrect dosages, or incorrect drug-drug interaction assessments. In a document generation context, producing a visit note, a hallucinated medication name is embarrassing and requires correction, but it is caught before any harm occurs. In a prescribing context, where the AI output triggers an actual prescription order, a hallucinated medication is a patient safety event. The Medical OS architecture addresses this specifically through the BNF grounding requirement. Every medication recommendation must be verifiable against the British National Formulary. That is a meaningful guardrail. But it is only meaningful if it is enforced architecturally. If the system cannot produce a prescription recommendation that is not in the standard library, not just as a policy statement. Failure mode 2, unverified imaging interpretation. AI image analysis has made dramatic advances. Radiology AI systems can now detect specific findings, certain fracture patterns, certain tumor characteristics, certain anomalies with accuracy that rivals or exceeds radiologist performance on those specific tasks. But task-specific performance is not equivalent to comprehensive imaging interpretation. A system that is highly accurate at detecting a specific finding can be dangerously overconfident about findings it was not specifically trained to detect. An agentic system that extracts structured findings from an imaging report, which is a text processing task, is different from a system that interprets the imaging itself. In my practice, I use AI-extracted imaging findings as a structured input to my own clinical review. I do not treat the AI extraction as equivalent to my own review of the image. The extraction is a summary. The clinical interpretation is my job. The critical failure mode here is when an AI's imaging summary is treated as authoritative and drives clinical decisions without physician imaging review. A regenerative medicine case where the injection target is determined by an AI-extracted finding that the physician has not independently confirmed is a case where an imaging interpretation error leads directly to a procedural error. Failure mode 3, autonomous prescribing of controlled substances. This is a red line with no exceptions in my thinking. Controlled substance prescribing is the highest stakes prescribing decision in medicine. It involves federal law, it involves DEA registration, it involves state monitoring programs. It involves direct risk of addiction, diversion, and overdose. No agentic system, regardless of its model performance, should have the authority to prescribe a controlled substance without direct physician review and sign-off on every individual prescription. This is not a capability question. A future AI system may have the clinical reasoning capability to make controlled substance prescribing recommendations that are, in aggregate, as good as physician recommendations. That is irrelevant. The legal structure, the ethical weight, and the irreversibility of harm in controlled substance prescribing errors require the human physician to be accountable for each individual decision. Architecture should enforce that accountability, not rely on the AI to stay within voluntary limits. Failure Mode 4, Prior Authorization Fraud. This one is less discussed but genuinely dangerous in the current healthcare landscape. The prior authorization process, EARs, where a physician practice requests insurance company approval for a specific treatment, involves clinical documentation that must accurately represent the patient's clinical status. An agentic system that is optimized to maximize prior authorization approval rates without strict grounding in the patient's actual clinical documentation could generate authorization requests that misrepresent the clinical situation. That is fraud. It is also a patient safety issue. If a treatment is authorized on a misrepresented clinical basis, the treatment may not be appropriate for the patient's actual condition. The defense against this failure mode is the document-centric interaction model. Every authorization request generated by an agent must be traceable to specific clinical documentation in the patient's record. The agent cannot invent clinical facts. The physician reviews the authorization request before it is submitted and confirms that it accurately represents the patient's documented clinical status. Failure Mode 5, Autonomous Treatment Plan Modification. An agentic system with access to a patient's longitudinal record and outcome data is eventually capable of identifying that the current treatment plan is not achieving the expected outcome and suggesting modifications. That is a valuable capability. It is part of what I described in Episode 8 as the Zone 5 analytics loop, but the transition from suggesting modifications to implementing modifications is a bright line that the architecture must enforce. A treatment plan modification based on outcome data requires physician clinical reasoning. Is the outcome deviation due to treatment failure, patient noncompliance, a measurement issue, or an intercurrent clinical event? The answer to that question determines the appropriate response, and no current agentic system can make that determination reliably. The agent can surface the signal. The physician must interpret it. Each of the 5 failure modes I just described has an architectural defense, and I want to walk through them because I think this is where the practical safety thinking for clinical AI deployments needs to live. Against hallucinated medications, formulary grounding enforced architecturally, every medication output must match a record in the vetted formulary. The system cannot generate a prescription recommendation for a compound that does not exist in the standard library. This is the Medical OS standard library principle applied directly to the highest risk output category. Against unverified imaging interpretation, scope restriction on imaging agents. The imaging analysis agent has read access to imaging reports and can extract structured text findings. It does not have the authority to render an independent clinical interpretation. Its output is labeled Structured Summary from Radiology Report, while it requires physician imaging review. The physician review gate is structural, not optional. Against autonomous controlled substance prescribing, hard permission block. No agent has the authority to initiate a controlled substance prescription. The controlled substance prescribing workflow requires direct physician initiation. The physician opens the prescribing tool, enters the patient and drug, and signs. There is no agent pathway to that workflow. This is the permission architecture. The action is simply not available to any agent account. Against prior authorization fraud, documentation traceability requirement. Every prior authorization request generated by an agent must include, in a structured metadata field, the specific clinical documentation records from which each clinical claim is derived. The physician review step includes confirming that the derivation is accurate. If a claim in the authorization request is not traceable to a specific clinical record, the request is returned to the agent for correction before physician review. Against autonomous treatment plan modification, outcome signal to physician, not to execution. The outcome tracking agent outputs a structured flag. patient X outcome at week Y is Z% deviation from expected trajectory. Suggested review triggers, list. That flag goes to the physician's review queue. No modification to the treatment plan occurs until the physician has reviewed the flag and made an explicit decision. The agent proposes, the physician disposes. I want to give you a practical framework for thinking about red lines in clinical AI deployment, because I think every practice that is seriously planning AI integration needs one, not as a legal document, though legal review is appropriate, but as a clinical thinking tool. The framework I use has 3 questions. Question 1, is this action irreversible on a patient safety relevant timescale? Prescribing a medication is irreversible in the sense that the patient may take it before any error is caught. Generating a draft visit note is reversible. Nothing happens until the physician reviews and signs. The more irreversible the action, the more essential the physician review gate. Question 2, does this action involve a legal or ethical accountability structure that requires physician responsibility? Controlled substance prescribing, informed consent, treatment decisions, and billing certification all involve direct physician legal accountability. Those actions require direct physician involvement, not just physician approval of an agent output. Question 3, does this action depend on information that the agent cannot reliably access or verify? A patient's current symptoms, their understanding of their diagnosis, their functional status today, information that exists in the real-time clinical encounter, not in the chart, is information the agent cannot reliably have. Actions that depend primarily on that real-time clinical information should be physician-initiated, not agent-initiated. Applying this framework to the 5 failure modes, all 5 fail at least one of the 3 tests. Medication prescribing is irreversible, involves legal accountability, and often depends on real-time clinical information. Imaging interpretation depends on information the agent cannot fully access. Controlled substance prescribing fails all 3 tests. Prior authorization involves legal accountability for accuracy. Treatment plan modification depends on real-time clinical reasoning about the cause of outcome deviation. The framework is not exhaustive. There will be novel situations in practice where it needs to be applied in real time, but having the 3 questions internalized means that when an agent capability is proposed, the system can now do X automatically. You have a systematic way to evaluate whether X should be in the agent's autonomous scope or should remain in the physician review pathway. I want to close with a more philosophical point about the safety problem, because I think the technical failure modes we have discussed are actually the easier problem. The harder problem is what I call trust calibration. Trust calibration is the question of how confidently a physician should rely on an agent's output, given that the agent sometimes produces accurate outputs and sometimes produces errors, and the errors are not always obvious. A hallucinated drug name is obvious if the drug does not exist in the formulary. A subtly wrong dosage recommendation, one that is off by a factor that could be a typo or a model error, is much harder to catch. The danger is automation bias, the documented tendency of humans to over-rely on automated system outputs, even when those outputs are incorrect, simply because the system presents them with confidence and authority. In aviation, automation bias has contributed to accidents where pilots failed to override automated systems that were clearly malfunctioning. In medicine, the risk is that a physician who is tired, working fast, and has reviewed 100 correct agent outputs in a row will fail to catch the 101st that contains an error. The defense against automation bias is not just the architecture, though the architecture helps by preserving explicit physician review gates. It is also a culture of active critical engagement with AI outputs. Every agent output should be reviewed as a hypothesis that needs to be confirmed, not as a conclusion to be rubber-stamped. That cultural discipline is harder to encode in software than the architectural guardrails. It requires training, habit formation, and a practice culture that treats AI tools as intelligent assistants, not as authorities. The clinicians who use these tools safely are the ones who understand them well enough to know where they fail. That is why this series exists. I am not trying to convince you that agentic AI is uniformly trustworthy. It is not. I am trying to give you the understanding to use it where it is trustworthy and recognize where it is not. The safety problem in agentic clinical AI is real. It is solvable. And it is not primarily a question of model accuracy. It is a question of architecture, accountability, and culture. The red lines I described, no autonomous controlled substance prescribing, No direct patient clinical communication without physician review, no unverified imaging interpretation driving procedural decisions are the places where the physician must remain the decision maker, not because the AI is incapable of reasoning about those questions, but because the accountability structure, the irreversibility, and the ethical weight of those decisions require a human to carry them. An agentic system that respects those red lines and is deployed within a permission architecture that enforces them is a system I can use in my practice with genuine confidence. An agentic system that is positioned as able to handle those decisions autonomously is one I would not deploy, regardless of its benchmark performance. That is the honest physician's position on agentic AI in medicine. Not uncritical enthusiasm, not reflexive rejection, rigorous engagement, clear red lines, and architecture that enforces them. Next week is the final episode of the series. I'm going to give you my physician's roadmap for the next 5 years, predictions across documentation, diagnosis, longitudinal care, federal contracting, content and marketing, and medical education. And I am going to tease what comes next for this channel. Season 2, which is going to go deep on a specific application of agentic AI that is the frontier of my clinical practice, longevity medicine. I'm Dr. Trevor Turner. This is the Medical Operating System.